A couple of weeks ago, I said that we as Unitarian Universalists ask people to commit to a way of being and loving each other in community that both accepts each other as we are and actually expects we will change and be changed by one another. Sean Parker Dennison, in that poem we just heard, Letter to Our Better Angels, says, we are hoping to make arrangements for an increase in the percentage of goodness and presence of admirable qualities in ourselves and in others, especially in others. We respectfully request that this come easily and with immediate delivery and a dependable warranty and at no extra cost. I'd guess that many of us are here, a part of this religious community, because we want support in becoming our better selves, and we want to see more goodness in this community, in this world. Yet grappling with the questions of what it means to be a good actor, a good neighbor, a good citizen, a good community member today is not easy. It does not come with immediate delivery of answers. There's no warranty that when we find an answer, that answer will always remain the same. And just asking the questions might cost us something. As y'all know, we are living in one of the most politically polarized eras in our nation's history. The polarization can sometimes make it feel as if people are living in completely different realities. The Pew Research Center recently, published a report that said a month before this last presidential election, roughly 8 in 10 registered voters on both sides of the political spectrum said that their differences with the other side were about core American values. And roughly 9 in 10, again, across the political spectrum, worried that a victory by the other side would lead to lasting harm in the United States. So today I am not going to delve into the reasons why we are so polarized. Instead, I want to ask some questions about how we as Unitarian Universalists living in East Tennessee are called to respond to this polarization. Now, first, I want to acknowledge that the polarization we are experiencing, along with actual violence that has been happening in our country, not just January 6th, but other examples, political violence, that this polarization causes deep anxiety and even trauma. I see and hear about this anxiety on at least 3 different levels. First, I hear from people who are having a hard time staying in relationship with family members or other people they love or work with because of political difference. In the last year, I have even heard from people who are concerned about family members who they feel have, in effect, been brainwashed by cult conspiracy theories. And they're wondering, how do I stay in relationship with this family member? What can I do? So that's the first level of anxiety I just want to name. The second level of anxiety is on the local community level here, where those of us who maybe hold more progressive religious or political values than the majority, or hold marginalized identities, may feel actually insecure in our jobs, in our homes, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our community, going about our day-to-day lives. and may wonder where safety resides, where safety for us resides. And then the third level of anxiety I just want to name is that some of us are feeling anxiety about our very democracy and the democratic process. Some of us have had the experience, perhaps for the first time, of questioning the wisdom of the collective in our democratic process. Now, some of us have questioned that for a very long time. But there is a feeling like now we are on a dangerous precipice and the possibility of losing our democracy entirely. And on top of that, there are fellow Americans like pushing us off the edge. So I want to name that there's several levels of tension and anxiety operating at the same time. They're connected. Today, I am mostly wanting to focus on that middle level, that level of the local community, the level of people living in the same geographic area together, relying on the same services, going to the same schools and grocery stores. So there is this general call right now for unity and civility following this last election. It's all over the place. But most especially, I anyway am hearing it from folks in the political center or slightly left of center spheres, whether that's actually political leaders calling for unity and civility or religious leaders calling for unity and civility. There are projects and programs popping up all over the place meant to get people talking across political, racial, and religious divides. One question I want us to ask, and just keep asking, is what does unity actually mean and who gets to decide? I was reminded recently that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s great letter from a Birmingham jail was written as a response to a letter from moderate white clergymen in Alabama that was entitled A Call for Unity. In that call for unity, those clergymen, and they were all men at that time, asked that King and the civil rights movement supporters there stop their campaign of nonviolent direct action and instead engage in negotiating with the local power structure and use the courts to pursue their ends. But I want to remind us today that the very purpose of nonviolent direct action is to cause polarization, to force people to choose a side, and to bring to light inequities and polarization that already existed, but very often was invisibilized by those in power. And so those who are used to being morally comfortable and used to being seen as good, like those white Alabama clergymen, were suddenly very uncomfortable because they were being forced to choose a side. They were being asked to choose a side. And so let us today ask, who is calling for unity? Who is calling for civility, and why? And is unity or civility the same as beloved community? I want to say that I sense in myself and in many of you a desire to understand those who think differently from us, and a general wish that we could all just sit down and have a nice conversation. In fact, I myself recently reached out to someone I know who is on the other side of the political spectrum just for conversation and connection. It was a good conversation. I felt heard. I think the other person felt heard. It was very polite. I felt better afterwards as an individual, but I left feeling a sense of unease as a citizen that feels accountable to a larger collective. So on the interpersonal level of relationships with people we know, there is perhaps a real spiritual need for understanding and reconciliation. I think this is partly a desire to be seen as a human being with worth and dignity, and to be recognized as someone with goodness and admirable qualities, regardless of how we vote. This need is something I do think we need to pay attention to. And I do think that efforts that help us listen to the quote unquote other and practices that help us humanize the other are very important. Our community of faith and other religious communities especially can play a really important role in providing containers of meaning for these kinds of conversations. A respect for the sacredness of all life calls us to approach those who differ from us with a practice of open-heartedness and listening for their life struggle and how it might connect to mine. Our universalism calls us to remember that all people, no matter what, are bound up in a greater love than any one of us, even if we can't quite love that person individually ourselves. Rush Limbaugh is bound up in a greater love, even though I am not angel enough to love him myself, right? So we pay attention to that yearning on the interpersonal level, and there are these efforts that I mentioned to get people talking together interpersonally. Efforts like Braver Angels, which I know some of you in our congregation have been involved in getting started here locally. You know, trying to create space, a little more space for people to hear each other across difference. A way to practice questioning what we think we know about other people. A way to keep the other as a real human being. Maybe a way to keep things complex instead of reaching for simple solutions. And there are lots of groups out there doing this. There's Essential Partners, A Seat at the Table, The People's Supper, Courageous Conversations, Bridging the Gap, just to name a few. As we widen the lens out to the community level, is listening to another individual on the other side enough to move us towards true beloved community? And what are the pitfalls of engaging in those conversations? I want to tell you a story from my college days. I was at a small liberal arts college in another state. This college had a historic connection to a particular faith tradition. And this was the mid-90s, y'all. During that time period, more people, including myself, on campus were coming out as lesbian, gay, bisexual. Unfortunately, we were not yet acknowledging or including transgender folks in any integrated way. There was a LGB student group formed. There were articles being written and published in the campus paper about lesbian and gay rights. And remember, it was around this time, 1993, that Don't Ask, Don't Tell became official policy. And then by 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act was passed. Now, while the student body and the faculty of this institution was overall quite progressive, the governing board with the connection to the particular faith tradition was not. Let's just say there was at the very least unease about all this open talk about the acceptance of a wide range of sexual orientations and sexualities. Now, one staff person on campus, a person with some power, but not a lot of power in the institution, decided it would be a good idea to hold some open conversations so folks could listen across difference and hear from all sides. This person even invited some outside speakers in, including a representative of the so-called ex-gay movement, folks who believe that non-heterosexual orientations could be quote unquote cured through therapy. So this person who organized these conversations had a really good intention, and I really believe that. They yearned to hold everyone together. They longed for people to just listen to one another politely. But the impact was that even further harm was done to people who had already been harmed. In this instance, in this story, from my perspective, civility and unity was valued over respect and justice for the lives of people who had already been marginalized in conversations for a very long time, for the entire history of the institution, in fact. So perhaps engaging in conversation across differences can help us feel better about ourselves. Perhaps it can lead to increased understanding and lowering of tension. But what happens next? Will there also be conversation about power differences, about how people with different identities have actually been locked out of the conversations that set policy that determine who lives and who dies on a very literal level? So my question this morning is how we as Unitarian Universalists can connect that interpersonal project of seeing human beings across our divides to the very important project of making institutional change so that the flourishing of a human life is not predicted by someone's racial or economic or immigration status or any other identity category. I want to tell you another story that I think helps give an example of a direction to go. I mentioned a group called the People's Supper a little while ago, and this is a project that was launched right after the 2016 election. One of their organizers writes about their work, quote, "We knew enough about how human brains work to know that we weren't going to argue our way through the divides in our country. One thing that actually can change minds," they thought, "was when we have a positive encounter with someone from a different group that runs counter to our assumptions." So they trained hundreds of hosts around the country who organized suppers where people of different political, religious, racial, ethnic identities would sit down, share a meal, and a conversation. So strangers were sharing their life stories with one another, and in a best case scenario became a human being and not a label. The People's Supper project became well known. It kind of made a big splash. They were profiled in national publications, but pretty quickly even the organizers of this project noticed the limits of their model. One of their organizers writes, quote, "The suppers were meaningful and heartwarming, but most were at best a feel-good experience. At worst, they did harm, allowing white liberals like me to pat themselves on the back and to consider our work complete. So they reached a crossroads. This organizer writes, "We recognize that fixing structural problems would depend on our capacity to work together, but we also knew that hearing each other's stories is not enough. You cannot ask someone who's been subject to marginalization to come to the table if there is no promise that things will change." So when the People's Supper organizers began working with community leaders in Erie, Pennsylvania, they changed their approach. They connected a series of suppers over several months, leading to a People's Summit that included people with actual formal political power in the community. And at this summit, ideas were shared, task forces were created, and lines of accountability. So out of the stories that were shared and heard, there was movement towards changing structures and institutions. And then the slow, hard work of doing that had to persist. Otherwise, the story sharing didn't mean much. So I tell this story, I give this example just to nudge all of us, including myself, towards the place of no easy answers, no quick fixes, towards the both and, towards a lot more questions. If you find yourself yearning to connect and heal the political divides, I commend and respect that. I want that too. Those yearnings tell us something about our values, our desire for peace, our desire for health and security, our desire to live out the love that we seek for ourselves, our desire for beloved community. So as we pay attention to this yearning, let us also pause and ask ourselves some questions. What is my personal motivation or contribution to bridging these divides? Am I seeking to understand, to be understood, to feel like a good person? Do I need to simply be uncomfortable in the tension of the polarization for a while? As my colleague Heather Petit has written, what if what we're hungry for is the make do, make nice, polite society hid the wounds and cruelty? I think some radical personal honesty about that is called for, not to stop us from acting, but to be clear about why we are doing so. And let's also ask some questions about the limits of interpersonal sharing projects and what they do, what they don't do. So if you're interested in engaging in this interpersonal kind of sharing across difference work, then also ask, what else am I prepared to do? What are the inequities that cause the divides in the first place? Am I willing to also be active in addressing those? And finally, the question, are we seeking surface level healing and unity at a further cost to some people in our broader community? I want to hold out the possibility that it is possible to both enter a space where there are no sides, just human beings, and at the same time to be really clear about whose side you are on. I think about Elie Wiesel and his invitation to us to refuse to be in the presence of the humiliation of another human being. humiliation even with words. And I think about Dr. King and tree, who also call us to enter into that space, refusing to demonize anyone, holding up the humanity of everyone, and at the same time refusing to let mistreatment and injustice go unnamed and unaddressed. Because we know that beloved community cannot exist when real inequities and power differences are erased in the name of unity. Beloved community cannot exist when some people aren't at the table at all. As I said a couple of weeks ago, when talking about Dr. King's concept of beloved community, we get closer to beloved community when we put a powerful love into action, even in the midst of forces that seek to divide us. Now, I know some of us also have an equally strong, if not stronger, yearning to retreat to our bubbles, to feel the safe haven of being only with folks who think like us, and to write everyone else off. Please don't misunderstand me. I am also not suggesting that we should do that. As Unitarian Universalists, we are called to be a part of building beloved community, not just within the sanctuary of our congregation, but in our world. Perhaps a practice of listening to people who are politically or religiously different from us can keep our hope alive, our very hope alive that beloved community is possible, because most of us are simply human beings struggling towards being better people. In the end, we each have to decide for ourselves, based on our own motivations, our own history, our own relative power in this community, what we are willing to do to be a part of that never-ending quest towards increasing goodness in ourselves and in each other. Sean Parker Dennison, who wrote the letter to our better angels that we heard at the beginning of my reflection, also wrote a poem entitled Letter from Our Better Angels. And I want to close by sharing a part of that poem with you today. Letter from Our Better Angels. Dear one, we have received your letter and we hate to tell you, not hate so much, but are a bit afraid to say we cannot grant your requests as stated, but can only remind you of familiar things. First, faith. Faith in yourself and trust in others. We know it can be terrifying to be vulnerable, but only when you share your softest side will we be able to break through. Next, hope. Hope is not an empty fairy tale. It is the true story of all the times human beings like you have found a way to create the future, though you didn't know how. And of course, love. Love that demands that you cherish all people, not just yourself and safety. Love that is not satisfied until every argument ends abruptly when one child says, "That hurts." There is so much to learn and relearn. The world teaches you to be hard, to negotiate and defend, to avoid giving too much and to the wrong people. There are no wrong people. You also are not wrong. If you want to change the world, first be sure you are changing yourself. Be tender, be kind, Be at peace. Be all the things you wish for. It isn't without cost, but it will be free. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.